This is the history of the generations of the heavens of the earth when they were created, in the days that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. No plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh God had not caused it to rain on the earth. There was not a man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Yahweh God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground Yahweh God made every tree to grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it was parted and became the source of 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It flows through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the same river that flows through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. This is the one which flows in front of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. Yahweh God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but you shall not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die." Yahweh God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." Out of the ground Yahweh God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called, every living creature became its name. The man gave names to all the livestock, and to the birds of the sky, and to every animal of the field. But for man there was not found a helper comparable to him. Yahweh God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. As the man slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Yahweh God made a woman from the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and will join with his wife, and they will be one flesh." The man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Isn't that the cutest little creation story? I'm hugely fond of this version. I'm Gail, and I want to thank you for joining me for this short reading today. If that's all you wanted to hear, then you can skip off to the next video. But if you want to stay for a rather longer than anticipated literary and historic analysis, some musings on religious art history, and centuries of myth editing, I would love to have you stick around. My asthma is really bad today, so if you're hearing like a wheezing sound, those are my lungs having fun. I'd like to gently remind you that this is a secular analysis, so while I really do want to hear the version that you grew up with, and I mean that, I really do want to hear the version you grew up with, I'm asking folks to refrain from preaching in the comments. I also want to tell you that I'm not a professional when it comes to biblical literature. My degrees are in art history, and art education, and I spent several decades in a career focusing on fashion history. Now I'm a farmer. In other words, I'm no biblical scholar. Like many Americans, I grew up in a Christian community, and like many people my age, I looked around at the churches that I went to, and I was like, this is a load of BS, and I walked away. But I never lost my love of these stories. If you'd like a more scholarly analysis than what I can provide, I highly recommend Esoterica for a Jewish history perspective, Dr. Dan McClellan for a Christian perspective in both his short and long form, His short form is under Dan McClellan, and his long form is in Data Over Dogma with a bonus Dan. And any Bart Ehrman interview that's online is going to be decent, I think. And his perspective has always been very informative. He is also a secular scholar. But let's get to this delightfully sweet little creation story. So we're going to start with history. History! When was it written? 900 to 800 BCE. Some scholars push it as late as the 600s. And then it was heavily edited in like the 300s. And that's sort of debatable too. It's believed to have been written in the southern kingdom of Judah. Who wrote it? Not Moses, he's just the pen name. The Jawist source is generally identified by their use of the name Yahweh for God, and by using a highly personified God, as in he shows up in person a lot. The Jawist source is not 100% agreed upon, but it's generally agreed upon in North America-ish, not so much in Europe. There's a whole thing about that, which you could get into if you really wanted to. Usually I will put setting under the literary analysis section, but because there's a little snippet that I want to talk about here with real locations, we're going to kind of blur between fantasy and reality here. So, the Garden of Eden is set in the east of the land of Eden. While people always try to find this on a real map, tons of fun, it is intended to be an imaginary place, a place of myth, or a place that humans can no longer get to, having been barred from there by magic and a guardian angel, not the nice kind, but that hasn't happened yet in the story. The story is set in the Garden of Eden. In this tale, it's a lush, temperate environment with loads of fruit trees. Has friendly critters in it, and requires a gardener, alternately God and the man. Chapter 2, 10 to 14, talks about 4 rivers. And while it's likely that all of these places were real, they are intended to be symbolic as well. 4 is an important number. I'm not going to get into Jewish numerology here, but I will mention it when it matters. You can explore that on your own if you want. There's like each number has its own meanings and stuff like that. The storyteller is jumping ahead in time by listing the lands and nations, which were all named after the descendants of Ham post-flood, which again has not happened yet in our story. The section seems to be an odd break in the narrative, but is largely regarded as part of the original story, not a later addition. Pishon flows through the land of Havilah. I've actually looked up how to say these now, so you'll be really proud of me. Which has gold, onyx, and bdellium. You don't say the B, it's bdellium. Bdellium is a semi-transparent oleogum resin extracted from the Commiphora waiti plants from Commiphora africana trees growing in sub-Saharan Africa. According to Pliny, the best quality came from Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. Other named sources for the resin are India, Pakistan, Arabia, Media, and Babylon. That's from Wikipedia. Thank you, Wikipedia. Was it a precious stone? Was it incense? Or was it other uses? In this context, I would have assumed it was a precious stone, like amber. But it's hard to say. It's mentioned a couple times, but that's it. It's worth noting that no one is sure which river the Pishon refers to. Everything from the Nile to the Ganges has been suggested. But 2 likely candidates are the dry Wadi al-Batan, going from the mountains in Saudi Arabia to Kuwait, which fits the regions of Ham's descendants well, and the Sefi Drud, starting in northwest Iran and emptying into the Caspian Sea. There's plenty of gold and precious stones there, and the trees grow there as well. Gihon flows through the land of Cush. It may well refer to the Blue Nile, though some scholars disagree and place it in Mesopotamia, near the city of Kish and Sumer. Some other scholars have suggested the sea, or, there's like 2 or 3 seas that you can pick, as there was no distinction between fresh or salt water in terms of rivers then, they were all just called rivers. However, it's very likely that the Gihon is the Blue Nile, and that Cush is Upper Egypt into Ethiopia. And it also fits the region of the Cushites, as it's just across the river from the Arabian Peninsula. The Tigris, or Hiddekel, flows in front of Assyria. The Tigris starts in modern-day Turkey and then flows through Syria and Iraq. There's no question that this is a real river, and this is the one that they're talking about. The Euphrates, there's no land mentioned in the passage. It's assumed this is the same river as it is today, which, like the Tigris, starts in Turkey and flows through Syria and Iraq, emptying into the Persian Gulf with the Tigris. Since the Euphrates plays such a large role in the rest of the biblical stories, the location is, as my generation would say, a big, huge no-duh. Literary analysis. We're going to start with characters. We have 3 main characters. We have Yahweh God in the leading role. He gets 2 names in this one. We have the man in the speaking role, and we have the woman in a non-speaking role. Since it's very short, it hardly seems worth summarizing. Yahweh God makes the heavens and the earth. A misty, moisty morning moistens the ground. Then he makes man and breathes life into him on the same day. Then the timeline gets a little fuzzy here. Is it all the same day? Or is it a series of events over an unspecified amount of time? Yahweh God plants a garden, puts the man in there, grows more plants, puts the 2 trees in the middle of the garden. We break for a river geography lesson. He puts the man in the garden again. Must be the poor guy didn't like the geography lesson. Tells him to eat these fruits and veggies, but not those fruits. And then there's a death threat and a lie. And then he sets the man to work tilling and tending the soil. For how long? We don't know. He decides that man needs a companion, so he makes the animals and birds from the dust. The man names them. None of them are suitable companions for the man, so Yahweh God performs a costectomy and makes woman from man's rib, and then there's an etiological explanation, which is a narrative that explains the cause or origin of something, whether it's a natural phenomenon, a social practice, or a cultural belief, for why people get married, followed by them not being ashamed of being naked. That's foreshadowing. Literary devices and themes. The use of imagery is the use of descriptive language that creates a vivid mental picture or sensations for the reader, often appealing to the 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Genesis chapter 2 is a very short story that has a children's book cadence to it. It uses simple imagery and relays the sequence of events in order, except for the geography lesson. Verse 5 describes a barren land, but goes about it by moving backwards from a lush one using negative imagery. In verse 9, we get words like pleasant and good to describe the garden plants. Gold, onyx, and bdellium would have evoked richness in the mind of ancient readers. Today it's just a little confusing. I think the cultural history of the visual imagery around the Garden of Eden is very strong. We have a little over 1,000 years of glorifying this mythical garden, so the actual words are rather plain. But they are embellished by the weight of the art we've seen, how the story is played up in religious communities, and all of the other literature that we've read, and all the things that we've been told throughout our lives. Anthropomorphism is a technique where human characteristics, emotions, or behaviors are assigned to non-human entities like animals, objects, or natural phenomena. This device allows writers to make the non-human more relatable, engaging, and understanding to human audiences. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 through 25 uses anthropomorphism to portray Yahweh God's actions in this creation story. Yahweh God performs human actions and displays human characteristics, including forming a man from dust and breathing life into him and planting the garden and putting the man in it twice because the geography lesson was scary. These actions portray Yahweh God as if he were a human sculptor or a gardener or a parent, and he performs physical actions the same way that a human would. Symbolism is a figurative language technique where an object, person, place, or event represents something beyond its literal meaning. The second creation story employs symbolism in quite a few places. The dust of the ground, this is self-referencing for later, but it has to do with being connected to the earth on a very basic level. Humans can't live without the earth. We're part of it, and we return to it after death. This also plays into the cursed ground later. Something Mars springs to mind. Breath of life. If you stop breathing, you die. Asthma. The first breath is often considered the start of life, since air or oxygen is invisible. Calling it a spirit, a soul, or wind was a reasonable analogy for a critical life function back in the day before people understood the properties of gases. Importance of water. Just like breath is life, water is also life, especially for plants, which everything ate. Vegans rule in this part of the story. Readers of the time would have more context for understanding the river geography passage than we do today, and I've read a few different theories about how that could have been interpreted, especially as it relates to the descendants of Ham, but realistically a settled life would have been almost impossible outside of the river valleys at this point in time. The Garden of Eden is associated with an easy life of the gatherer, no hunting yet. I find it very interesting that this particular creation story has man the gardener, the plowman in it, and it's this particular creation story where the association of a work-free paradise comes from, when there's always been work in this tale. It's the whole reason man was created. I'll get to that. I'll get to the blending of the two stories later in the episode. Then there's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This has meant a lot of different things at different times. It can represent a shift from a state of innocence to self-awareness and responsibility, paralleling the transformation of childhood into adulthood, from existing in an animal state with actions based on instincts to developing rational thought and morality, and then having the ability to deliberately choose the harmful or evil action over the beneficial or good action. Sort of like the difference between a family dog and a wild raccoon when they get into the trash. The family dog is sorry, and the raccoon flips you off and knocks over another trash can on its way out. I'll cover the concept of culpability in the next part of the story. On a mythological end, this is the food of the gods. Mortals aren't supposed to eat it. And like Prometheus with fire, the fruit transforms humans from one of the naked animals to being like the gods. I'll touch on the lie in the CCC shot. I'll touch on the lie in the CCC shot. That's called alliteration, where you have to say the same sounds multiple times in a row, and you're going to stumble over saying the same sounds multiple times in a row. I'll touch on the lie in the CCC section. Part of me can't help but think of Yahweh God as a kid with a science project, and his parents are part of the Council of Gods, and one of them telling him, "Now Yahweh, you keep those humans away from those trees," and him saying, "Yes, Mom." Comparative mythology. This is comparing this creation story to other creation stories. I didn't quite choose them at random, but it was almost random. So we're going to start with the Greek ones. This actually does have quite a bit of influence on this. The Greek myths surrounding the creation of humans are similar to the biblical myths, just with more gods. So Prometheus creates man from clay. Athena breathes life into them. So two gods instead of one are involved in this. And instead of forbidding the humans from becoming more like the gods, Prometheus expressly goes against Zeus's orders and steals fire for his humans so that they can be more like him. Zeus is standing in for Yahweh God in this regard. It's after this pyromania episode that Zeus splits the humans into male and female echoing the biblical tale of Eve being called forth from Adam's rib, which is another variation not told in this particular story. The alternative Greek myth is that Zeus asks Hephaestus to sculpt the first woman as a punishment for man for taking the fire Prometheus gave them, which then leads to all the suffering in the world. Another parallel in Blame the Woman, and also another sculpting of a woman. But realistically, the humans were already suffering. Zeus always gets his way when it comes to that. In Canaanite mythology, what we have of it, El is the creator god, and he can create things with his word, by forming them from clay, and by having sex. Of the three, the only one that Yahweh God doesn't engage in is sex, or rather that comes much later in the story, and it's largely symbolic, and it's done by delivery angel. That has nothing to do with this. In Babylonian mythology, in the Enuma Elish, Marduk makes the sea and the sky from Tiamat's body. He creates day and night, clouds and rain, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and then he wants to create man from his own blood, but E suggests sacrificing a different god, and Kingu is chosen. So they make humans as servants to the gods from the blood of a god, and then they order the building of temples and the city of Babylon. Well, there are more parallels in the first biblical creation story to the Babylonian mythology. Man as a servant of a deity, a gardener in this case, is a common theme that they do share. Now we're going to do some comparison to itself, so to the first creation story. When I was looking for public domain and Creative Commons art images to illustrate this part of the story, I noticed something really interesting. The 7 days of creation are well and faithfully represented, right to the point of creating humans, where the images leap over to this second story with not quite yet Adam and Eve. They always list them as Adam and Eve, but they aren't actually named yet in either of these stories. I found one image of humans and animals being created on the 6th day. Just one. There is a distinct lack of images for the mists that water the earth in Genesis 2:6. I found one AI image, and I found one oil painting, which I think is supposed to be separating the waters from the waters, but we're going to wedge it right in here anyway. And precious few of God creating man out of dust, even fewer that don't have tons of trees everywhere. The only one that I found that was true to the text of the second story was Michelangelo's creation of man on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. We get a hint of green in the background, but no lush forests. I found one image of God making the Garden of Eden, 3 of the Tree of Knowledge and Good and Evil without the serpent and Adam and Eve standing under it, and none of the 2 trees with the angel and flaming sword fence from the expulsion. I did find plenty of angels and flaming swords at the gates of Eden, but not in front of the trees. Nothing for man tending or plowing the garden before the animals and women are created, and a few with just God and the man in the garden with the fruit tree without Eve. Again, they aren't named yet. I had slightly better luck finding some representations of man naming the animals, but it was far more common to see both of them with the animals in the garden, an interesting blend of the 2 narratives. After that, there are countless representations of God calling Eve out of Adam's side, not that they were named yet, but none of him fashioning her from his rib like a craftsman or sculptor would. Again, an interesting blend of the 2 stories, ample images of the temptation and expulsion, which have not happened yet. So with all of that in mind, let's have a look at these delightful little illustrated charts I made in Paint. It'll make you feel like a kid again. Please keep in mind that the second story was written first, so while I'm presenting it in the order the Bible does, that's not actually the order of editing, and we will get to that in the second chart. Let's talk about timing. The first creation story has a nice, neat progression of events divided into 7 days. 7 is another numerology thing. The second creation story begins on what would be a combination of the 3rd and 4th day, and then it plucks man out of the 6th day into that day. The rest of the second story takes place in an undefined amount of time, but it gives the impression that it's more than just a few days. The order of living things. In the first story, humans and land animals are created together, and humans last, or with humans last, as the culmination of creation. While in the second story, man is the first living creature made, with everything else coming afterwards, and woman being last in both. There's a joke about practice making perfect in there. So woman's place in the timeline remains unchanged. A miracle. Materials of creation. Both creation stories use earth as the starting material for humans and land animals. In the first story, fish are called forth via word from the waters. Or sometimes it says he caused them to come forth. There are no fish in the second story at all. Who rests? God rests in the first story, and man rests in the second story. Now, in the second diagram, we can see how things were edited. So there are some story elements that have been moved or ignored in art and modern Protestant common understanding. I can't speak for what Eastern Orthodox does, and I'm only familiar with Catholicism from art history, but based on the image search, this jives with what I learned. The first 5.5 days of the first story are intact, and so is the seventh. The last part of the sixth day is replaced with the human creation elements from the second story. Human actions are moved to Eden after the seventh day, and the tilling gets moved to after the expulsion. The water elements, the mist and the rivers, are largely ignored, though the rivers do get pictorial representation in the post-God nap Eden. Conflicts, contradictions, and controversies. Creation 1 versus Creation 2. This is the one we've all been waiting for, right? Aside from the timeline of events of creation, the stories aren't really in conflict. They are two very different stories that share similar themes, but it's not impossible to mash them both together in the same ball of mythical Play-Doh and come out with a similar color. In the first story, you have God or gods creating humans as an image of themselves with the expectations that the humans will manage the animals and plants and make babies. So mimic the behavior of the gods is the mini-me concept. In the second creation story, God makes man because he wants a gardener, a servant, which is a pretty typical reason for a god to make a human when it comes to mythology. The order of creation in 2 versus modern understanding. Again, this is not really a controversy since the order isn't observed by most practicing Christians that I know of, and we're only talking about the second creation story here as written. Please tell me if I'm wrong. I'd really like to know if there's some big, huge dogma fight out there over this. I would love to hear it. This second one is purely mythological and symbolic. A human could not have survived before land plants existed, before there was food, before there were land animals, etc. And a human man could not have existed before a human woman. Though this is neither more nor less absurd than people being called forth with word creation from the earth at the same time. I think this logic may be why the first creation story timeline is generally more accepted. There's fewer questions from the kiddos about, what did Adam eat? Living things from dust. So again, I'm sort of harping on this one. This is the golem spell that I've heard some atheist channels complain or giggle about. It's true that some biblical literalists and creationists genuinely believe the first living things were sculpted out of clay and brought to life with a magical breath from a divine being. And that this, in combination with the kinds from the first creation story, is a true sticking point in the fight against teaching evolution in public schools. So I'm always loath to tell people what to believe when it comes to matters of faith. I really think that you can believe whatever you want to believe or you don't want to believe. I'm fine with it, okay? That said, this story has a lot more value in its symbolism than it does in the timeline and method of events. It was never meant to be taken literally. And I think that the folks who stop there are losing out on a lot of the deeper meaning of the story. Moreover, religion doesn't belong in public schools, because I certainly don't want my child learning the wrong religious dogma, and I can promise that mine is way different from yours. If you want your children to only learn certain information in school, you need to send them to a private school that aligns with that, or you need to homeschool them. Feelings about chimps don't in any way erase the verifiable, repeatable, scientific data that says that they are our closest living relatives and that our common ancestors diverged 6 to 7 million years ago-ish. But I'm still skipping that family reunion. Thank you very much. So, I mean, I get it when folks don't want to be related to chimpanzees, but a lot of people have family that they'd rather not be related to as well. So, controversies. Okay, here we go. Woman from man's rib. The first creation story has humans created together from the earth, though this particular text does not exactly say that. Some of them do, some of them don't. The second creation story has woman sculpted from a man's rib, a bit of transmutation magic there. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing terribly different from any other creation myths. Plenty of them have blood magic of some form. This one is far less gory than most of them. The big issue is that this is the beginning, the hint, the foreshadowing of sexism and oppression. It's not there yet, but it will very quickly go directly there and not budge for thousands of years. Mythology is not an excuse for treating people poorly. And yet here we are. Okay, God's lie. This is the big one. I love this one. In Genesis 2:17, Yahweh God tells man that he's not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if he does, he will surely die on the same day. This seems to be one of the deal breaker among many for some folks when it comes to believing in their religion. So why did God lie? What would be the reason for lying? Taking a look at this, not from a religious perspective, but from a literary perspective, on a practical level, Yahweh God wanted a gardener, a servant, a companion/pet, not an equal. He already had equals. And a lie or threat from a parent figure is often an effective deterrent to dangerous or annoying behavior. Stay in bed at night, or the monster under it will eat your toes. Keeps the kids from roaming around in the woods at night and being eaten by a real predator. It also makes them afraid to hang their feet over the edge at night when the only thing under there that's truly terrifying is dust bunnies. On a mythological level, this is about humans becoming like God, albeit accidentally in this case, and we'll get to that in more detail in the next episode. From a literary standpoint, this is the main character. Okay. From a literary standpoint, this is the main character's first big mistake, possibly the big mistake, and everything hinges on this moment in the plot. It's the giant, or everything hinges on this moment in the tale. It's the giant plot hook that gets the rest of the story going. If Yahweh God had told the man the truth, would the man have kept his hungry little 8 fingies off the yummy, yummy fruitsies? Probably not. But the fate of humanity would not have hinged on a lie. And that goes for the book and for a good chunk of the real world. Ending on a lighter note, a much lighter note. Ending on a lighter note. Aliens did it. This is not exactly a controversy. It's a bit of fun fan fiction. The God as alien bit is always amusing. Just be very careful that it does not cross over into racism. Looking at you, History Channel. I have some questions which you can choose to answer down in the comments, or you can do them on your own as part of a study if you would like to. So in Genesis 2, the second creation story, why were humans created? How are the humans created? And what method? How does the setting differ from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2? And I'm talking about like landscape and that type of thing. What are the reasons that you think that God lied about what would happen to man if he ate the fruit of the sacred tree? Why are we only talking about, or we are only talking about the lie here, not about what happens in the next chapter. We'll get to all that next episode. Thank you so much for joining me on the Secular Scriptures today. I hope this gave you quite a bit to think about. Let me know in the comments what version of the creation story you grew up with, and any other relevant thoughts on Genesis 2, chapters 4 through 25. If you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. If you want more episodes, subscribe. I hope to see you next time for Forbidden Fruit Snacks. I want to thank the World English Bible for letting everyone use their translation, and Wikipedia for actually having the answers to my very silly questions about ancient myth, and to Wikipedia for actually having the answers to my very silly questions about ancient mythological rivers. All images used are in the public domain, Creative Commons, or my own via MS Paint. And I apologize, I did not do a good job on recording my sources, so you'll only find a few in the description below the video.